With 2024 being over, admittedly for a while now, I always like to look back at the year of tanks that I played and choose the ones that stood out to me the most. We've done this twice before and the rules are the same, but just in case, I have to clarify that this is not a list of tanks that were released in 2024 that I played and enjoyed, but it's a list of my favorite tanks that I played in the year regardless of their release date. Tanks released in 2024 can of course make it on this list. And everyone will have their own list of tanks played and that they enjoyed during the year themselves, so leave your list down below and we'll see what everyone is into and if there's any overlapping tanks. But without further ado, let's get into my top tanks that I played during 2024. And we're starting with a tier 10 banger right off the bat. This tank was always just a solid tank, but the Leopard 1 was buffed this year and given 420 alpha damage. Its heat rounds were removed in place of premium APCR rounds, but that doesn't change the fact that this was an overall buff and a mighty big one too. Because as a sniper medium with fantastic camo and view range, and top speed and gun handling, hitting harder per shot really solidifies that role as the sniper medium. Now sure, it called into further questioning why even play the AMX-30B, but I still like both tanks. However, there's just no denying that the Leopard 1 is just too good. The reliability of the gun in combination with the speed to rotate positions and fall back as well as spot for yourself just give this tank an undeniably strong presence in any battle. Its downsides of size and armor are easily negated with just some distance and firepower, allowing this tank to even trade well with 120mm guns if you get into those tight scenarios. I must mention too that the CS63 was another comparable tank to the Leo 1, but has since been nerfed this year with its reload being lengthened without the alpha increase. So the Leopard 1 was not only buffed, but its competition was nerfed, giving this tank a unique power grab that definitely can be felt when playing it. But despite all that, it doesn't get any higher on the list purely due to the fact that it was actually very good before all of that. It's just now even better and was extremely enjoyable for me to play this year, so it takes the 10th spot. And for similar reasons, the 9th tank on this list is here as well. The Panzerknacker Otto was another German tank with an increase to its alpha damage that just turned an already good tank into an even better one. I even recently made a video talking about this tank and how it was earned through the commander mode way back when that was still a thing. And some of you might not even know what commander mode is or was, but it doesn't matter, because this tank was a fun tank to play from the start. But it's been buffed to be even better now. First, its armor was buffed, which was helpful, but it's still an up-tiered tank, so it's not insanely helpful. Being a tier 7 Jagdpanther up-tiered to tier 8, the armor needed to be buffed. But the next buff to its alpha damage really cemented this tank as an all-time favorite tier 8 for me. It's got this 3-round 88mm autoloader, and before it did 240 alpha damage for a clip potential of 720. But now, with its 280 alpha damage buff, it now has a deadlier clip potential of 840, allowing you to destroy more tanks in just 2 clips with much more reliability. It's accurate, nimble for a case-mated tank, and just an overall blast to play that it too had to make this list because of its buffs. But would you believe me if I told you another tank on this list, in the 8th slot, makes it on the list due to alpha buffs as well? And it's also German. The Wraith Panzer 58 makes it due to its alpha buff not once, but twice this year. It was buffed from 240 damage to 280 alpha damage. And obviously its counterpart got the same treatment with the Mutts. But for some reason they buffed the HP of the Mutts, but not the Wraith, which was odd, and the reason given was the spaced armor. But then they buffed these tanks shortly after again, giving them 300 alpha damage with their 90mm guns, and actually gave the Wraith an HP buff, but not to match the Mutts, but instead overtake the Mutts on HP by 100. So now the Wraith has 1500 HP and 300 alpha damage. What a damn glow up. And at first I didn't think I'd even like the Wraith due to the mobility limitations that come with the spaced armor. But after that second buff, and for my review marathon I did of all my monster tanks that I owned, I found out just how much that I loved the Wraith. I still love the Mutts too, but the Wraith really does feel like a different tank to the Mutts, with armor that was actually way more reliable than I initially thought it would be. My underestimating of this tank definitely had something to do with why it stood out to me this year, as the surprise I had playing it definitely made it more memorable and stands out amongst all the tanks that I played. And this next tank in the 7th slot also surprised me this year, and is also German. Would you look at that? The Mouse makes it onto my list. Super heavies aren't my thing, or so I thought. My first top 10 list included the Type 5 Heavy just because it felt like the best super heavy at the time and was fun to play with its HE and 330mm of heat pen. Now the Type 5 is still just as fun despite the nerf it had, but after playing the mouse to counter the vigilantes, I realized just how much fun it is, and I honestly think it's my new favorite super heavy tank. It can still use some love, but as it is, I have so much fun with this tank. And it has the best secondary weapon in my opinion if we're not counting the Rogel Dorn of course. But the solid 490 alpha gun, accompanied by the 75mm coaxial gun, gives it so much more versatility than something like the E100's garbage secondary or the Type 5's hull locked secondary. And the mouse having the most HP gives trading so much more power to you as the player on top of that secondary that can rip apart decently armored tanks while your main gun's reloading. And because of the surprise that I had while playing this tank and how much I actually enjoyed it, just like the Wraith, it made the list. That's all the Germans for now, but the sixth tank on this list is actually the Patriot, and like the previous two tanks, it makes its way on the list due to my surprise at how good it was. It's one of those really old tanks that I just didn't think would feel any special, being a heavy Pershing type of tank. I thought, meh, I'd probably prefer the T-32, or if I wanted mobility, just a Pershing. And some might, and even I might, still actually prefer that, but that still doesn't take away from the fact that when I earned this tank for the 4th of July and actually played it, it shocked me that I was enjoying it as much as I was. It wasn't slow, it had a good accurate gun, and armor that I could actually rely on. So why did I think this tank was one that I could brush off? I don't know, something about it just looked so average to me, but when I actually played it, it felt so good. So it definitely deserves a spot on my list since it was such a memorable experience even 6 months after the fact that I'm still shocked about. And sticking with American tanks is our fifth tank, the MBTB. This tank was the 10-year anniversary tank that was given to players with 7 years or more of tenure on the game for free and discounted for everyone else based on how many years old their account was. So after getting this tank for free myself, it was decent. It wasn't great, and its 420 alpha damage had a bad reload that allowed for 440 alpha damage tanks to actually out DPM it. But it had 10 degrees of gun depression, and a weak point that wasn't so obvious unless you looked at the actual armor model. So it was pretty easy to do well in it, in my opinion. And I enjoyed playing it regardless of the DPM. But then Wargaming near the end of the year decided it needed a buff, and oh boy did they give it a buff. It gained 20 more meters V-range, being the best V-ranged heavy tank now and being on par with the Patton's 420 meters base V-range. On top of its alpha damage being buffed to an odd 430 alpha damage, and the reload getting much better, giving the tank nice and competitive DPM on top of great spotting capabilities. It turned a decent tank into a great tank in my opinion, and allowed me to finish the third mark on the tank too. So it had to make the list due to its marking and its buffed state that made it much more competitive to play with, especially since people had learned by then how to actually pen this tank. Having that DPM was more helpful than ever. There's another tier 10 American tank that was basically given away for free in 2024 that I also 3-marked as well. The T114 Bat makes it onto the 4th spot on the list because of its unique challenge it provided and because I 3-marked it. Yay! Having only 2 round types and super low shell velocities made this tank quite hard to snipe with. Then having camo worse than the Terran made it just questionable to why even play the tank. But the troll armor, small size, and great clip potential made it well worth it. 390 meters V-range and the small size made it sort of a secondary light tank, with actual heat pen being a tank destroyer and 1260 clip damage to punish anyone who got too close. But if you loaded HE, you had also pretty good pen and 1710 clip damage to play with, easily taking out the enemy light tanks if you could hit and pen all 3 of your shots. It's a tank with clear drawbacks and clear power, but not too much on either side. Getting trolled by your gun elevation happened to me a lot. Fighting other bats and not penning because of the troll side skirts and turret armor was something I had to get used to, but in the end, it's a strong tank in the right hands and a tank with a high skill floor and ceiling. And I personally like that a lot. Now we're in the top 3, and this one is the only tier 9 on the list that I've just enjoyed ever since it was released. That being the Lorraine AMX M4. This tank is just so much fun. Great turret armor, gun depression, fantastic speed, and 2 good gun options. You can go with the faster firing 400 alpha reliable gun, or the harder hitting, less reliable, but honestly more fun 560 Alpha gun. I've slowly been loving the 560s so much more on the AMXs because of how accurate they are, and premium AP is really nice despite the lower pen compared to their 120mm. This Lorraine is just a satisfying combination of power, but with your usual French downsides. But I think what makes it stand out to me is the top of the turret. It is the large turret of the AMX M4s, but it's got smaller weak points, making it better hold down. But the hull is actually super weak, so the M4s are still better on flats where they can wiggle their turret weak points and rely on their frontal armor. But being a medium tank player means I actually kind of prefer the Lorraine, and thus it made it onto the list this year because of that. Our number 2 pick is the lowest tier tank on this list, and one that might surprise you guys, but it's honestly my favorite tier 7 tank destroyer in the game. Hell, maybe even my favorite tier 7 tank overall. The Cheeto SP released in 2024 alongside the Japanese tank destroyer line itself, and it was a standout for many, myself included. I already knew I would like this tank because I played it on Blitz and I loved it there. That doesn't mean it was guaranteed that its power would exactly cross over well, but after seeing it on PC, I had hope, and now that it was here, I could confirm it. It is indeed as good as I remembered. It's a nice, quick-firing 320 alpha damage gun with fantastic armor and good mobility. It's hard to make case-mated tanks this good, but it is. And one great thing about the Japanese tank destroyers are their premium AP rounds, which aren't even super slow either. They're just amazing guns, and this one was a standout tank of the line, with maybe a little bias from having played this line on Blitz beforehand. I came in though expecting the tank to not perform to my standards that I had given it, but it did, and it exceeded those standards, so I had to make it a high placement on the list. But there's just one more tank that I love more than this one, and many of you who frequent the Twitch streams probably already know what that one is. But before we get to our top spot, let's go over some honorable mentions. Our first honorable mention actually is going back to some Germans, the KPZ-07RH. This 90mm German tank does 200 alpha damage, with great HE rounds and a super fast firing gun. It's got good camo, speeds, and gun depression, and even a decent upper plate that'll save you every now and then from a penetrating shot. But this tank got a lot of flack on its release for some reason, but personally I really enjoyed it, and they sold it as a Tank of the Month deal in 2024 too, so hopefully you got your hands on it because it really is a slept on tank. Our second honorable mention is also German with the Wind of Arrakis. This tank was really cool to see, and I love that it was a new tank that we didn't have yet, but still a unique armor model to the actual skin, whereas PC's visual model doesn't match their armor model like ours does. So I think we actually did the Dune collab much better here on console. And it's a decent tank, and was gifted to me by our friend Leafeon, so thank you Leafeon. It's even got cool VFX when getting shot of this shield going around the tank that flickers. But what makes it an honorable mention instead of actually making on the list is its automatic siege mode. They made a sweeping change to auto siege mode tanks, but that still didn't solve the problem of random bouncing and the disconnected reticle. Thus I couldn't put an auto siege mode tank in my top 10, but it made it to the honorable mentions at least. Really cool tank. My last honorable mention is the Ho-Ri 3. This is the tier 10 tech tree Japanese tank destroyer, and the whole line was good in my opinion, and I really enjoyed this unique 149mm, 700 alpha damage, double AP round, 400 meter view range tank destroyer. It's just a good tank that I think deserves to be mentioned at the very least. What also deserves to be mentioned is my honorable mention with the Gal 48 Avenger, only because it introduced the heat up mechanic. I had been hoping for it for a while now, and I hope more tanks adopt this system and we see less massive clip-based tanks in the game with this system now in place. Is it perfect? No. And I also haven't even personally played it, which is why it's an honorable mention. You feel me? Anyway, let's get to our number 1 tank. And of course, that would be the Shpatuk TVP 100. This is the only current Czechoslovakian tank destroyer in the game, and ever since its release, it's been one of my favorite tanks of all time. This year, it took the title of my favorite tank of all time, as I finally 3-marked this puppy. This was also the first tank I ever reviewed on the channel. It's an atypical glass cannon with low alpha damage and decent armor against HE. It's still a paper tank though, and its DPM more than makes up for its 250 alpha damage from its 100mm gun. It's packing great penetration values too, with 270 standard AP and 330 premium heat rounds, and even 100 millimeters of HE rounds that deal 420 alpha damage, really pumping up that DPM against low armor targets. Being open top 2 means you can't run vents, but that means running optics, gun rammer, and a camo net is just a no-brainer. You have decent speeds to relocate with, but not the best gun depression. But it doesn't matter. When you're eating with this gun, it feels amazing. It might take a lot of shells to rack up damage, but you have great gun handling and accuracy to do so with. I get people really like big guns that hit hard, but the Spatuk to me will always outshine any other tier 8 tank destroyer in the game, and having tier 10 levels of pen makes being bottom tiered not even that upsetting. This uniquely alone tank really makes me wish to see a Czechoslovakian tank destroyer tech tree line, because if they're anything like this tank, I would love them all. And a tier 10 version I think would go pretty hard. Our lowest tier 10 tank destroyer alpha damage right now is 390 damage with the Sturv 103B, so it'd be interesting to see what a 300 or 320 alpha tank destroyer at tier 10 would be capable of. It might never happen, and PC is testing a second Czechoslovakian tank destroyer at tier 10, but it's a reward vehicle with 770 alpha damage. So not really in the image of the Spatuk, but maybe one day I'll get a whole tech tree of tanks as fun as this one. Anyways, thanks for watching, and of course leave your own list down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.